Hello and welcome back to my kitchen. I'm Anissa and today we're making some honey garlic ribs. I have 1.5 kilos of beef rib here which I've patted dry, and I'm going to give it a really generous seasoning with some salt. Remember, because it's quite a big quantity of meat, we're going to need plenty of that seasoning on there, and some fresh cracked black pepper. I've given it a really generous seasoning with salt and pepper. Next, we're going to add 1 full bulb of fresh garlic. Yes, you want plenty of fresh garlic in this. When it has finished cooking, the garlic won't be as potent as you might think. I'm going to add a teaspoon of crushed red pepper flakes, just for that little hint of spice. And I also like to add a really good amount of sriracha. I'm thinking maybe around 2 tablespoons worth of sriracha hot sauce, 1 teaspoon of dried ginger. If you're using fresh, around 1/2 to 3/4 teaspoon of fresh crushed ginger should work really well. Around 3/4 teaspoons of coriander powder, not too much, but just enough. 3 teaspoons of sugar. Brown sugar also works really well, and that's just going to give it a little bit of sweetness. 3 tablespoons of ketchup, a tablespoon of soy sauce, actually maybe 2 tablespoons soy sauce. So we want 2 good tablespoons of soy sauce, and 1 tablespoon of vinegar. I'm using white wine vinegar. Apple cider vinegar also works really well. And this is just our marinade. We'll be adding the honey for our honey ribs later, because we don't want that sugar in that honey to start caramelizing too soon and burning our ribs. So we're going to combine this lovely rub onto our ribs. Make sure you coat each and every side. And you're going to basically let this marinate for a few hours before we cook it. I'm going to cook it for 8 hours in my slow cooker until they're almost falling apart. Well, not quite, until they're very tender, but not quite falling apart just yet. If you don't have a slow cooker on hand, you can cook it in a pot for around 2 hours or until the ribs are almost very tender. Or similarly, you can bake it in the oven at 160 degrees Celsius, again until they're almost completely tender, and then we'll start our next step. So I'm going to let this marinate for a good few hours before I set it in my slow cooker. Make sure you spread that marinade on every single side, coating this really nice and evenly. If you want to, you could even taste the marinade, just make sure that the seasonings are right for you. So I'm going to let my beef ribs cook in my slow cooker on a really low heat for around 8 hours. I'm not going to add any oil or water because these ribs release so much fat on their own as it cooks, and because the marinade itself is quite wet and it will release its own moisture, it's just not going to be necessary. If you're worried about your ribs burning, you can add around 50 millilitres of water to the bottom of your pot. But with the slow cooker, I just don't think it's necessary. If you are baking it in the oven or cooking it in a pot, however, you might want to start it off with just a tiny brush of oil on your tray or in your pan, just to help your ribs not to stick. Make sure you cover your ribs over with some heavy-duty foil whilst it's in the oven, just to prevent it drying out, and it's going to really help it cook through. My ribs have been slow cooking all night, and I've just tested them and they're really quite nice and tender already. A fork goes into that meat very easily. So now we're going to add our honey. I'm adding 3 tablespoons, and maybe 4 tablespoons. And I'm going to melt that in the sauce around our ribs because I want it to really dissolve in there. I don't want to move the ribs too much at this point because I want them to keep their shape nicely and not just start breaking apart. And because, as you can see, there's still lots of liquid in there, even though I didn't have to add any of my own, And what I'm going to do now is let this saute on a medium-high heat in this pot and keep basting my ribs with that sauce around it until that sauce becomes really sticky and a little thickened, and it coats the ribs nicely and you get this almost delicious glaze on your ribs. If your ribs have been baking in an oven and they're not quite tender yet, you can still add your honey at this stage. Cover it over and let it cook together until your ribs are really tender to how you like it, and then turn up the heat to 200 degrees Celsius, remove the foil and occasionally baste your ribs until that glaze has really thickened and you've got a lovely brown on your meat. Same goes if you're using a pan. So I'm just going to stir the sauce slightly where I added the honey, just to make sure the honey is fully melted into there. And I'm going to try to baste my ribs and let this start cooking on a medium-high heat until that sauce thickens nicely. And these ribs are ready when that glaze has set and they're really tender, and you can just see they're coming off the bone nicely. But you still want it to hold its shape. You don't want the meat itself to just be falling apart. And some of that leftover glaze, which you should still have plenty left, and it should have thickened. I like to just brush some of that on right at the end, just so you get some of that extra honey and sweetness on there, and for that lovely shine and garlickiness. And I like to serve mine with a bed of rice, some corn and some green beans, just some simple sides, because I want the ribs to be the centre of attention here. And if you really like the glaze, you can put some into a little bowl and use it as a dipping sauce. But that's all there is to it. If you liked the recipe, please do leave a like, subscribe and click that notification bell, and I'll hopefully upload more again soon. Thank you for watching.